During the 17th century, there's a whole group of philosophers in England that came into being. They wrote and so forth, and they basically created the current philosophy that we live under now of liberalism and in the economy and also in politics. The leading philosophers at that time were people such as Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, John Stuart Mill, and also John Locke and Jeremy Bentham. And all these people influenced the founding fathers. If you have done any study of any of them in the Constitution, you'll know about Smith and John Locke, for example. Well, in Smith and Malthus and Ricardo, they were primarily economists, and so was John Stuart Mill. And at the time, what they were trying to do is explain the development of their economy, going from feudalism to capitalism as the Industrial Revolution started to take place right in front of their eyes. And they were trying to explain this and look into the future of what was happening. And that's where so many of their theories came into being. Adam Smith's invisible hand, for example, and John Locke also of his liberal political ideals. Well, underneath all this, there is another philosopher by the name of Jeremy Bentham who also had a lot of influence. In fact, you can actually go see him even still today. If you go to the University College in London and go to the South Cloisters in the main building of the college, you can find his body preserved and on display for everyone who walks by it. It's stuck in a little wooden cabinet, something he called an auto icon, and he created this in his will, and he told the college to put his body in here and preserve it, because he was one of the people who helped found the college, and he also trained many of the leading professors there, such as John Stuart Mill. And in fact, even today, they'll sometimes take his body out to meetings of the college council, in which Bentham is still listed on the roll as present but not voting, so that his eccentric presence can live on. Although today he's got a wax head. Apparently his original head has been damaged over the years. In fact, it got stolen a few times in student pranks, so it's now locked away securely. Well, Bentham's contribution to philosophy is mainly, besides training all these other philosophers, he also had a lot of political ideas. And a lot of these ideas were about forming people and how to control people in society and create them into new people. And this is a subject I've started to touch on in part 1, where I started talking about the so-called science of man and how this came into being in the military. Well, with Jeremy Bentham, he started to think about this and lay down basic tenets and philosophies which he wanted to see implemented in society. And the best example of this is one of his inventions, the so-called Panopticon, which was used to reform criminals. Now, let me explain to you exactly what this is, because this one example will help distill to you the philosophy of Big Brother and how this new science of man decided to try to reform people and control them. Now, Bentham was trying to reform the prison system. Actually, before him, hundreds of years before that, from the time of man up till about the 1700s, you really didn't have the prison system like you think of it as today. Instead, people were punished through torture and other, well, mainly through torture. If someone did something wrong, you would do the same thing to them. The Code of Hammurabi, for example, if someone steals with their right hand, you cut the right hand off. You don't jail them and make them do work or labor or something like that. Instead, you punish them for their crime. Well, the basic thought behind that was that crimes are committed against society and against the king, which represents all of society, all for one, one for all. So any crime that someone commits is also a crime against the kingship, and punishment is meted out by the king and people who work for the king. They're his agents. Well, by the 1700s, the notion of kings and society being structured through kings was starting to fade away, and we started to come into being of mass society, of democracy and republics and so forth. And Along with that were different notions of society in which you had judges and a legal system and so forth, but the goals of punishment became different. It wasn't simply to take a criminal and punish him for his deed, but the criminal should be reformed and returned back into society. And the goal was to create the perfect state, a state in which every person in it has its own place and his own part, and is a cell of the organism. Well, criminals were seen as defective cells, and one reason is because things were being defined as crimes which weren't before. For example, it wasn't simply stealing, but not working was considered a crime. Not contributing to society, basically, it was a crime, and people who did that had to be reformed. Whereas in the past, people like that were simply left alone. Well, that changed and became different, and part of the reason was because of the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't simply working in the military, but working in the economy also. Well, Bentham's genius, or his idea, was to create the perfect reformatory, and it was a prison in which you take people, you put them in, isolate them in their cells, but instead of torturing them or beating them or something like that, you used a different type of power, a power that was all-powerful and yet invisible at the same time. And basically what he did is he created this type of architecture in which the cells were open on one end, so you could watch the prisoner and what he's doing, and on the other end of the cell was a window to provide light. Now, the genius behind it, though, was that the prisoner never knew when he was being watched, because facing all the cells was a special watchtower in which the watchman sat in it, and the tower was blocked by Venetian blinds, so the prisoners couldn't see into the tower and know whether or not they're actually being watched or not. Instead, they were being watched and observed in secret. And what this did was it enabled, or it caused prisoners to want to conform to whatever the person in the tower wanted them to do, because if they didn't, they could be punished. If they did, they could be rewarded, and so forth. So this was seen as the perfect reformatory and training mechanism. Now, Bentham spent the greater part of the rest of his life, once he came up with this theory of the Panoptic Prison, of trying to get it created. He never succeeded in that. However, his ideas inspired generations of reformers and criminologists that came after him, and have done a great deal to create what we know of as the modern prison today, which did not exist before his time. Now, contemporary social critics assert that technologies of today can be deployed to create some sort of panoptic mechanisms invisible throughout all society. Surveillance by closed-circuit televisions in public spaces, on light poles, and so forth could be done to do this. Go in a workplace. If you work in Walmart, you're observed every day by camera. This type of thing. Similar methods were described in George Orwell's book 1984, in which the so-called thought police would control the citizenry by watching them through a telescreen and knowing their every movement. Well, we're not at that point yet, hardly. However, there are people in society, in positions of power, who would like to do something very similar to us. They would like to create the perfect panoptic state in which every action you take is monitored by them, and for the good and safety of all, of course. But they want to have the absolute power to know everything that you do financially, what you do on the internet, and everything. And I'm going to describe that and explain exactly who they are and what some of their plans are in part 3. But for now, I just want you to think of the notion of the Panoptic Prison and imagine the pictures and what it would be like to be in one.